And when you see people on a dance floor, it doesn't matter if you're a CEO, if you're a janitor, whatever problems you had from the day before, those are kind of left at the door. My name's Ed Vargas, and I'm the president of Divina World Foundation, a new nonprofit. I'm president of Vargas and Associates. I lead a consulting group for creating positive social impacts using tech in an ethical and humane way. I'm also a mentor with the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship and a mentor with the Conectado Bioinformatics Bootcamp, working with Stanford Medical Center and Accenture. A little bit about my background is I'm the first in my family to go to college. I got my business and law degrees from Santa Clara University, a Jesuit school in Silicon Valley. I've been involved. I first started in the packaging industry. And one of my goals in growing up was to be an executive at whatever organization I was at the age of 30. And I accomplished that as becoming a VP of sales and marketing for a packaging company in Northern California. I was recruited to another company and got recruited again into international publishing for a nonwovens publishing group talking about this new technology around the world. I was executive director. I was conference director and publisher for this group. And that gave me an opportunity to travel around the world, which was a real exciting experience. And then I went to work for a small tech startup company called AT&T. First became the person in charge of the Spanish preference segment for Pacific Bell, which then became SBC and AT&T. So I spent 20 years there working in a variety of roles, but also really got involved with the employee resource groups there as well. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm also a lifelong musician. For me, it's a superpower that can bring people together of all ages and backgrounds. And that's one of the key elements that I recommend to when I'm working with clients, working with organizations, is to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand what their needs are, what their priorities are, and you look for ways to collaborate. Again, speaking about my background, I've leveraged those various experiences. I've led nonprofits as a president. I've been in corporate groups and working with people that have resources. That's where I'm focused now, is to create collaborations with nonprofits, corporate ERGs, philanthropic groups to have greater social impacts, not only operating as a silo effectively in one location, but to create networks, to create news media, to get that message across and be successful and help other people achieve the same goals. So how do we do this? Well, from my background of going to a Jesuit school, it starts with credibility. It starts with gaining knowledge, sharing that information, being able to work with people, understanding that they may have a different opinion, but once you have a conversation, and some of these can be difficult conversations, but what's important to me is to find that place where you can agree and see things collectively, so that if you're working on a particular issue, if you're working on a problem, how do you each provide input? How do you bring diversity to the table? How do you keep looking at this and turning it upside down and seeing where are the gaps and how can we team together to really work at this and resolve some of these conflicts? I'll give some examples later on. So to me, collaborations have been the key strength in all the work that I've done. When I was at AT&T, I was certainly in leadership positions with the Hacemos, the Hispanic ERG, but I partnered with 5 of the ERGs there at AT&T. The largest one were the women of AT&T. We had situations where our groups partnered together in local areas, like I was in Northern California, but we would share best practices so that that same type of program could be shared with groups of the women of AT&T, the Hacemos group, I partnered with the Inspire Asian group, the African American group were the network, and we would work with these organizations to take a plan and increase their impact across the country. The things that are important, all of the AT&T ERGs were 501c3s. For example, we had financial reports, we had board meetings, we had notes that we shared with everyone, even if they could not attend. That to me is critical, is to establish credibility. And when you have people that if they're not attending, they still would have a voice to look at the notes and provide a response to the people of the leadership. And then there's a vote. There's a way that everybody comes to an agreement. And even if you didn't have a vote in that area to come to a conclusion, you're still part of the team. You still want to support what's going on. So in our current stage, when we're taking a look at meeting virtually, things like Otter AI can provide summaries. When you have a Zoom call, you can record that and share that chat. That's key in terms of, with so many busy schedules when people are in different time zones, that's one thing that I learned over the years as to how can we share information? How do we keep people up to speed? How do we get everybody making the right decisions collectively and then everybody moving forward with that? So things, apps like Slack, other kinds of ways that from a program management perspective, I would highly recommend that organizations work with those tools, again, to broaden the scope and to get everybody committed, feeling that they're providing input that changes the direction. As an example, when I was in the publishing business, I was leading conferences. They were 5 consecutive days about different aspects of the nonwovens business. And in that area, I did conferences like that in Florida, in Texas, and in Quebec, Canada. And then I had an assignment that the parent company bought a trade show in the paper industry in Tokyo. And my assignment was to do a nonwovens conference talking about the technology there in Tokyo. Now, my challenge was that I did not speak any Japanese. I didn't know anybody there. But I reached out and learned about the organization, learned about the culture. I met with the president of the trade association of the nonwovens industry in Japan, who was also CEO of his own company. I had my business card translated to Japanese on the back of the card. And when I met him, I presented my card and bowed down because he was a CEO. He was higher in his infrastructure than me and my level. So we connected, we bonded. In the Hispanic culture, you respect your elders. In the Asian culture, they also have high respect for their elders. So I had done some research and learned that why we were not getting all the senior executives from these companies to come to the US or Canada at our conferences, it was because unless they were able to speak English, impeccable English, they could feel embarrassed. And from a cultural perspective, that was not acceptable. So I suggested, well, we'd like to do a conference in Tokyo. So what if we approached it like the United Nations? With headsets, we would provide simultaneous translation so that the people that were from Japan could speak freely in Japanese, and we would work in advance with a simultaneous translation group. They would provide that information. Everybody would have headsets, and the audience could either listen to it in Japanese or in English, and vice versa. When the speaker was speaking in English, the person in the audience could also listen to it in Japanese. So that seemed to cut through that cultural barrier with that understanding. So to me, it's important when you're looking at effective communication, when you're bringing new ideas to the table, always stand in the shoes of your audience and listen from the perspective of what's important to them and create a program that's meaningful to them, and then they can take action going forward. Some of the examples certainly was when I worked at AT&T and we partnered with the women of AT&T. There was a program, it was a corporate initiative called Your Health Matters. Now, the driver for that was because that situation where people were now having absenteeism, people would not be able to come to work because they were sick. So corporate decided to put together this program saying, if we can provide information about your health, about a better diet, here's a way that you can take that, and perhaps they wouldn't have as many people being absent in the various workplaces that they had. So I reached out to the women of AT&T and came up with this concept called Mi Salud, your health in Spanish. And what we did is that I reached out to there was a HMO, health maintenance organization headquartered in Oakland, California, Northern California, called Kaiser Permanente. And I went up the chain getting them to agree to provide a healthcare professional on a quarterly basis that would come to our San Ramon facility. And I did the same thing up at AT&T, that we were allowed to share that health information on a quarterly basis to employees in San Ramon. But long before COVID and Zoom, I would record that presentation, upload it on AT&T's website, and share that content with the Hacemos chapters, 42 chapters across the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and the women of AT&T. We were allowed to keep that up there for 30 days. I also uploaded and shared the health information from Kaiser that were given to the people in the room, both in English and Spanish, and shared that as well. So, for example, it's not just the employee that may be sick. In the Hispanic culture, you also care for your children, you care for your abuelita, your grandmother. So if they're sick, sharing this information so that they are also not experiencing a problem or a sickness or a cold or something, that would also free up people to go to work. Now, that's a whole different equation now with remote work. But that was something that really worked successfully for 2 years. We had a TED Talk. We had other aspects of that, and it was recognized in one of the top 5 corporate programs there at AT&T. I also, when I was there, created, again, when people are looking at stereotypes or things on social media or in the movies and theaters, I was not pleased to see all these negative stereotypes. Where I'm working at AT with people that have worked there also for 10, 15 years as professionals. You never see those kinds of people in the movies. So I suggested that at a leadership conference in Texas, I worked with a volunteer radiographer, and we brought people, Hispanic Hacemos members and non-Hispanic members, into a separate room, and I asked them questions. I had them sign an agreement that we could use their images, and basically just asked them, tell me about your story, about your background, why you volunteer for these organizations like ERGs, and is that fulfilling for you? So I did that with about a dozen people, and we launched something called Hacemos Latino Diversity Stories. And to get it beyond just the employees at AT&T, we also created the first YouTube channel that is now still being used by AT&T employees to reach out across the country, because you can share that externally. So again, now more important than ever, living in Silicon Valley, we're looking at tech companies having headcount reductions and budget cutbacks. So what that means is that those organizations that were very, very large and doing work together, it's now more important than ever, where one ERG may not have the budget to do this program that they've been doing, but if you work together, if you partner together with the other ERGs in your company and work with other ERGs from other organizations, collectively, you can still, if you come to agreement on what it is that are the priorities that reach your local community there, you can partner and have a greater effect. So to me, it's not just accepting the limitations of a budget. That happens all the time in business. But how do you create a strategy? How do you change that situation? So that is a recommendation that I would have as we're going forward. Now I'd like to speak a little bit about identifying common goals and how do you work together. So you really need to have dialogues. It's not one person telling everybody, oh, I decided we're going to do this, so everybody turn to the left. It basically is you're bringing your leadership, your members together. How can you work together to have the resources that you have be most effective? And certainly in my experience with AT, having access to, I was the EVP on the national board for community outreach. So I would represent Hacemos at the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce convention, where they were having the top ERGs compete. They're at that level. But the idea was to share best practices and to meet with people that if they're working in their community and there's a great program, how do we give that visibility? One of the things that I have always looked at internally is that when I was growing up, my brother was this amazing percussionist. and I learned guitar. There was somebody in the Bay Area at the time called Carlos Santana, and I really loved the sound of that music. And for me, playing in a band, playing cover songs that a wedding party would like to have for their event, that to me is I would sit down with them in advance and make sure that even if we didn't have enough time to learn all the songs that they wanted us to play, that we could even DJ those songs. And when you see people on a dance floor, it doesn't matter if you're a CEO, if you're a janitor, whatever problems you had from the day before, those are kind of left at the door. And when people hear that music, they grab somebody and get on the dance floor. And that's that energy, that special energy, when you're providing that kind of input and you see that reaction from your audience, or in a case where you're working with a problem, how to resolve that. Tell people that I work with, bring your own music. Provide your information in a way that if you know your audience, how they can connect, how they want to get up, how they want to find, how can we work together? And if you put music and food together, that's a superpower as well. So to me, again, is thinking through not just yourself, your priorities, but with the team that you have, with the leadership that you have, as you reach out for, if it's a sponsor, if it's a partner with resources your group doesn't have, how do you present those ideas in a way that they want to help, that they're asking you, how can they be effective? So that to me is, I've had that experience with corporate organizations like employee resource groups or business resource groups. It's important to make sure that that organization is aligned with the company's objectives. That really makes sure that there's an opportunity there that people can work together. So from that perspective, you can address gaps here in Silicon Valley. There's a pay differential. The women that work at Silicon Valley companies get paid literally half of what a white Caucasian male doing the same work gets paid. So even at last year's Advocates and Changemakers Summit, during the day, we also supported the Latina Coalition of Silicon Valley because they were doing a press conference. And so here I am as the moderator and the person that created Advocates and Changemakers, but I brought two of our Latina HLX Plus members, and we went across from the Bill campus where they're headquartered at. We walked across to the HP building where they had a facility, and they hosted the press conference for the Latino Coalition for Silicon Valley. And we supported the fact that that needs to change. So again, you work with allies, you create that relationship, and that helps amplify voices, mobilize resources, collaborations. So for example, one of the things that we featured at the 2023 Advocates and Changemakers Summit with HLX Plus there in the Northwest region is that I featured a nonprofit that prior to that I'd worked with Procter & Gamble. We found that Procter during COVID, they were providing truckloads of their products, their household and personal care products. And we were able to find nonprofits that would pay the shipping cost from Cincinnati, where they were in their warehouse, to organizations that supported farm workers or communities that were underserved or in need. So too, for example, with the Ayudando Latinos of Sonar, they're a nonprofit supporting farm workers in Half Moon Bay, just a little south of San Francisco. And from that opportunity, we had Procter & Gamble ship products, retail value truckload of $500,000. And they were given free to the people that were there without that they didn't have other resources. Jobs were shut down during COVID. And that was something that I started there with them, but then also worked with other groups called, one, for example, was the Mission Food Hub that Roberto Hernandez created, again, during COVID, when people that were working in restaurants, all of a sudden, businesses were shut down. So he paid for the shipping costs for a full truckload that was given out to the community there in the Mission District. So over the last 3 years, I've facilitated 5 truckloads, roughly $2.5 million worth of Procter & Gamble donations. And from the Procter & Gamble perspective, is that getting their products to the Hispanic community can create that bond that they're looking for, is that when people go to the store and they see 3 products that can do similar things, but because of their brand loyalty to something like Procter & Gamble, because of that situation that I just explained, is that
they see the potential there. Again, when you're looking at, the 64 million plus Hispanics with the fifth largest GDP in the world, that's a growing economy. Hispanics tend to have younger parents. Hispanics tend to have more children. So if I'm the marketing manager for Nike or for some consumer goods company, I want to make sure I'm targeting and working with a growing segment like the Hispanic population. So that's talking about leveraging diverse strengths, bringing these groups together. We also need to share resources and share best practices. One of the things that I got involved in, I've mentioned it, AT&T with Seamless ERG, I helped create something called High Tech Day. And what that was in San Ramon, California, we'd invite local high school students to our facility, and we would give them STEM or science, technology, engineering, and math workshops. And to that point, my role was, in addition to giving them those workshops, I created a college career strategic planning tool. And I would give this to the students as a handout. And on one side, I'd say, where do you want to be in 5 years? Not me telling you what you should do, but what do you want to do? What's in your heart? What can fulfill you? And some of these kids, like myself, I was the first in my family to go to college. Some of these kids have never even been asked that question or even thinking about that. So I had them write down their vision on the back. And from their vision, then you need to set goals. So in 5 years, you have to have goals that you can check. And how do you do that? You put objectives on a timeline. So your first year, you list objectives where you need to be, the second year, the third year, the fourth year, so that you're moving in the direction to reach your goals for your vision. So you have vision, goals, milestones on a timeline. Now you need strategies. So for example, when I was at Santa Clara University, undergraduate business students, we paid $22,000 a year for tuition. Now at Santa Clara, it's $62,000 a year. So you need a financial strategy. You need to think through, I was fortunate, I applied and I got a scholarship to attend. At the same time, there are ways you can go to a community college and transfer over. So you're only having 2 years to deal with. Or there's also things now where you could be a paid intern at a company that potentially you might even go to work at in the future. So those kinds of things, when you say vision, goals, objectives on a timeline, strategies, top down, that tells you where you need to spend your time to keep moving forward towards your goals. Not doing this on a computer or a digital device. And that to me is, unless you're doing something along those lines where you want to be, you're in control. You can decide how much effort and energy you want to put together to doing that. Now, from sharing resources and best practices, it's important to measure that impact. So in terms of how do you take a look at what you're doing to make sure that you're doing things effectively, that you're bringing resources together that if you don't have, how do you bring them so you have a greater impact? We can go into detail in that in another discussion, but you need to distinguish. Right now, social media, what's going on in politics with our elections, is that you have to distinguish between bluster, people that are just talking and saying things that are not true, need to be fact-checked, versus people, if you've heard the expression, walk the walk. Those people are the ones that back up what they say with results. So to me, it's important to distinguish. One of the concerns I've got with artificial intelligence is that at Santa Clara University, there's an organization called the Markkula Center of Ethics. So when you look at technology, we want to be sure that the technology programs are not only equitable and accessible, but are providing the correct information that needs to take people going forward. And I can talk a little bit about that later. But from the standpoint of measuring impact, you need to have those metrics in place so that you can document to your corporate leadership that the activities are helping the business as well as their own organization. And that's how you bring in more people to support what you're doing, is to share the results. If they see those are meaningful, people want to invest. That's a key message when I'm with the Miller Center
for social entrepreneurship. We have over 300 mentors worldwide, and we work with entrepreneurs that have an idea to build a business idea, either in the area of helping the environment or helping an area that's underserved where we need to have resources to help the people that may not be even getting enough food, for example. And the key message there is, we have people that are experienced business people, very successful people in Silicon Valley, but at the same time, when you're talking to a Latino from a Latin American country, say in South America, or you're talking to an African woman from a country in Africa, there are some cultural differences. There are some issues because not everything is the way it is Silicon Valley. And even in Silicon Valley, what was working 20 years ago, things are completely changed as we go forward, particularly on the frontier that we're dealing with AI. So to me, it's important to provide and have those mentors at that facility, at the Miller Center, think through, how can I be the most effective mentor to help the people that I'm working with? So we've created an unconscious bias workshop for the last 2 years. And now we're focusing on an in-person as opposed to doing it virtually. We'll be on campus with those mentors and mentees, and we're calling this unconscious bias focus, building trust in an untrusting world. So again, it's how do we know the situation in different countries, putting yourself in those shoes, listening to people, and then the information you want to share to help direct them. You can understand more from their perspective, what they're dealing with, and then make sure you're giving them the most important information that'll work for them in their own country. Let me now focus on talking about what I created here in Northern California with HLX Plus. We now call it our Advocates and Changemakers Summit. And what I wanted to do with that is that I can't tell you how many leadership summits I've been to over the years, but what is important is when you have a new problem or something that needs to be addressed, you need to be an advocate for that idea. You need to understand what the dynamics are. You need to be credible. That builds trust. And if you give respect back, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get respect back. That's been always my mantra, my thought process when I'm working with organizations, building on your reputation, establishing that you are credible and people can believe what you're saying and not question or say, well, you're supposed to do that 6 months ago. So that to me was the driver to change the content. Build Vita ERG, at Bill, who had asked me to put together that half-day summit in 2022, came back and said, we'd like to have a full day for 2023. And so the 5 areas for HLX Plus, the bridge areas, I actually created 7 panels for that. So the bridge areas include things like education, health and wellness, economic power and entrepreneurship, representation and gender equity, and then culture, arts, and entertainment. So those areas are things that I reached out to my network, and I really tried to bring something new to the table, showing examples that can be replicated. So, for example, in the area for economic progress, one of the panels that I created, I brought in Belinda Hernandez Arriaga, the executive director for ALAS, the group that I helped with their Procter & Gamble donation. And once I started visiting their facility, I saw that for farm workers in Half Moon Bay, here in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, it's expensive to live, and farm workers make $25,000 a year. And how do we help make sure that they can afford housing for themselves, their families? So I met with ALAS, the leadership from ALAS, Victoria Sanchez de Alba, and we sat down with the city of Half Moon Bay. There was a dormant property that had been there for 6 years they'd done nothing with when they bought a larger parcel that they created into a community center. And I suggested, why can't we have the city demolish that house that's dormant and work with us to build a facility for affordable housing for senior farm workers? So fast forward, we met with the county supervisor at the time. We got it on a RFQ from the city. We worked through bringing in a new partner for affordable housing, Mercy Housing. And at that point, we were able to get the city to agree. We just got through a few months ago with the Planning Commission of the city of Half Moon Bay to approve the plan. So we now have a $40 million, 5-story facility for affordable housing for senior farm workers that will also include a first floor for a farm worker resource center that will have good Wi-Fi, a kitchen and a pantry for not just the residents of that facility, but for the community around that area. And my intention was to say, here's this great program. We're going to help, 40 people in this facility, 40 different 40 different families. But at the same time, that's a model that could and should be replicated, because affordable housing is not something that is just unique to Half Moon Bay, and it's not going to solve the problem. So that was the driver for me, was to create this Advocates and Changemakers Summit, as to how do you work through some of these difficult situations, create a solution that can be replicated. So from that perspective, on that same panel, we had Roberto Hernandez, who I've known for many years. He was the founder of something called Carnival. It's a parade and festival in San Francisco. Years ago, I helped him with publicity and promotion for the Cinco de Mayo 25th anniversary for their parade and festival, where I had the opportunity to work with Linda Ronstadt as a Grand Marshal, and Los Lobos was the lead band for the festival. So Roberto talked about his communication with the Biden administration and something called Project 40. And shortly, a few weeks after our summit in October, his organization, CANA, a nonprofit there in San Francisco, they announced that they had received a $6 million grant to work toward programs there in San Francisco, helping underserved communities. In addition to that, he decided that he was going to, being a lifelong resident of the Mission District, he's now running for city and county supervisor for District 9 in that area. So again, this Advocates and Changemakers, we were trying to bring people together that are doing great work. And by sharing the details of how they're developing and implementing their programs, we can get that kind of information replicated and help other peoples in other locations. Again, so from that perspective, from that same discussion there, that summit, Carmen Milagro was our director for our health and wellness group for HLX Plus Northwest region. And she's decided to also create her own nonprofit called Divina World Foundation. And I'm fortunate to work with her. Again, we're focusing on health and wellness issues with people of underserved communities nationwide. She's actually in Colorado this week, helping the Earthstock Festival that's there. And we had Divina World Foundation had a talent search where we had people compete to win the prize, where they'll be featured for 30 minutes on international streaming TV that'll be there in that festival, that site. So we were successful to receive many contributions and pick one winner. And so that will be a feature for this first year for Divina World Foundation. So Camille Garrick from Expandy TV and I are both involved working with Carmen to develop that. So again, it's an example of how we can bring advocates and change makers together. I became also a mentor with the Conectado Metaverse platform. Guillermo Diaz Jr., who was the CIO at Cisco, left Cisco, and he's created a new platform where back when I was doing High Tech Day, giving tech workshops to students on a one-day basis, he now has modules focusing on bioinformatics, things like Fitbits and Apple Watches, that technology, that coding. They're giving modules of that on a platform to people, students, older folks that want to learn that technology and find a career in tech to do that. So there's a partnership with Stanford Medical Center and the Accenture company, tech company, that they have their content on Conectado. So they learn, people that sign up and are accepted into cohorts, they learn that technology coding, and then people like myself will be their mentor, helping with their soft skills. So now that you've got this certificate that you know how to code, what are you going to do with it? Where can we get you to network with people on LinkedIn? Where can we connect with people that may have those kinds of jobs and you could learn from them directly, or perhaps even get an internship there and become some employee at that location, or start your own company. So that to me is the energy that Conectado brings to the table. When you talk about teaching virtually, it's not going to a building necessarily and learning just in that building. Conectado is a platform that can be, you can have people doing that kind of training at any time. So it expands the impact. So I'm a proud Conectado mentor. I'll be doing this now for going into my third mentorship with another cohort coming up later this year. So again, those are examples of what we did for the Advocates and Changemakers Summit last year. And I'm currently working toward developing another summit for 2024. Now, what do you think I'm going to say now? I want this to be a call to action. Just the same way I put together that summit, bringing advocates and change makers together, sharing best practices, being transparent in financial information, providing content that can help change people's minds. My call to action is for you to think, who do you, in your own network can you partner with? What organizations can you join to have a social impact where you are? That to me is the call to action. And if you'd like to reach out to me, you can get me on LinkedIn. We can provide that information. And I have my own consulting website, vargasandassociatesllc.com. So I'm here basically because my why is helping people come together, have a greater positive impact so that we can work through the challenges, the problems that we see, whether it's with the environment or something local, but bringing people together. You know, we're all human beings. One of the jobs I had before going to work at AT&T, I was the director for marketing communications for the World Affairs Council of Northern California. And at that time, we even hosted Mr. Gorbachev from Russia. He was there, one of the keynote speakers. And when I worked in that facility where we had speakers come in, I would go out for lunch and grab a sandwich, and you could hear 8 different languages outside because you had people from Europe coming over celebrating their summer vacation. The largest community in San Francisco is the Asian community, so they're right not too far from Chinatown. The Hispanic people in San Francisco are not predominantly Mexican, they're predominantly Central American. So things like pupusas, things that come from other countries, that to me is the value. That to me is the positive energy that we all have. I even had my DNA checked. And yes, with my last name Vargas and my mother's maiden name is Martinez, I knew that I would have Hispanic heritage, but I did not know that it would also include Norwegian background, Portuguese, Jewish, and African American. 6% of my heredity is from 3 different African American countries. So again, put yourself in the shoes of your audience. When you're speaking to people, I always recommend you should go visit other countries and see how you're perceived there. That to me is just such a key element, is that when you come back from other countries, not only can you appreciate the culture of the people that are there because they want to make you feel welcome, they'll offer foods that you've never tasted before. And when you come back, you can see that in the United States, everyone's an immigrant unless you were a Native American. So to me, it's how do we work together? How do we present positive messages? How do we get people to step up, bring your own music, get people to get involved and have a greater positive impact? That's something that works for me. It's my why. It's why I get up in the morning and look forward to having more conversations with you. Thank you.